Thank you, everyone. Please remain seated. When Nat and I were talking about me giving a lecture of some kind, the only guidance she gave me was make sure you finish on time so that people can have lunch. And as a result of that, I've actually changed my mind a couple of times about what this lecture should actually be about. Before we get into it, let me start with the obligatory disclosure slides. I don't have any disclosures, so I always show this picture when I give a talk. For those of you who don't know, this is a painting of Hippocrates refusing a gift from Artaxerxes III. It's a famous painting. I think it's in the Louvre. I can't 100% remember. But I do this because I don't have any disclosures. I don't take money from the pharmaceutical company. I say this, I mean, it's almost understood in a venue like this with this audience. But I think it's important to say it and to make it a standardized thing because it almost is pre-bunking one of the criticisms that's going to be leveled against you. And trust me, I've heard them all. They got worse during COVID, obviously. But I think this is the type of thing we have to start telling people so that they understand that this is to a very large degree this is a volunteer position, right? I make my money by seeing patients. I'm a cardiologist by training. Like none of the stuff I do, you know, speaking to the media or any of that is paid for because there's just no mechanism for it. And I think a lot of the public doesn't understand how much of what we do is really done as a labor of love, not because somebody's paying us to actually do it. So this is the class that I teach in university. This is what the course is going to be about. As a result of the previous talk, I'm almost tempted to go on a 60-minute rant about how this class is maybe different than some of the other critical thinking classes you're probably more familiar with, because I don't want to spend too much time on it because I have 130 slides to get through, and I'm not joking. But I think this is an interesting class because it's probably a little bit different than what you're typically used to. And that's because part of it is the audience. The audience for this class are public health students. So these are master's students doing a master's in public health. And so the history of this class, just to give you a brief thing, it used to be a knowledge translation class taught within the Department of Epidemiology about going from, you know, bench to bedside, that type of thing. The instructor who was giving it retired and the class was going to fold. And so Maru Karpai, who I co-taught it with this year, sort of revamped it from scratch last year and just made it a talking to the media class, largely influenced by what was going on with COVID and the pandemic and all that. And I came in last year to co-teach it with him. And so the class is still under a fair amount of flux because it was basically built from scratch last year and we're still sort of adding and subtracting things. And a lot of what we're teaching the students is interesting because up until Katie's presentation, I really thought of it as a critical thinking class. And then I'm like, actually, it's kind of not. It's more about a science communication class, which in my mind are related concepts, and yet they are a little bit distinct. And I think the rationale for that is that we went into it with the assumption that public health students are going to graduate knowing a lot of the things they should know, especially when it comes to the methodology stuff, which is a lot of the stuff that I talk about the dangers of subgroup analyses and correlation and the different types of studies, because they're going to get that. And it was interesting in that in teaching the class for the first time this year, I started to realize that's not necessarily true. I mean, they know it, they've been taught it, but it hasn't been internalized yet. And so I'm very curious to see what other people think, and I mean, maybe we can talk about this during the panel discussion at the end, but it's going to be really interesting for me to hear what you guys think about the distinction between science communication and critical thinking, how much overlap there is, whether we need to think about these things differently, and whether we need to approach these things differently. So all that to say, this was supposed to be a 10-second slide in the original runtime. But all this to say is that what we've done is we're teaching the students how to write a press release, you know, how to write a scientific paper. Because the reality is when you write you learn by doing, right? Nobody actually sits down and teaching you. So we have journal editors come in to sort of show them this is what you do, this is how the peer review works, because nobody actually formally teaches them that, especially at a relatively junior level, which is the master's level stuff. We had a couple of undergraduates in there as well. But like how to write a press release, how the press office of the university works, how you're gonna, how you're going to write for scientific journals, how you're going to do a podcast, because I do a podcast, because everybody has a podcast. But like, how do you do it? And we joke about that, but in fact, most government departments have podcasts now. The university has a podcast. McGill University has like several different podcasts of different faculties, all doing podcasts. This is going to become part and parcel of what you're going to have to do in academia. And to be fair, we are teaching to this group under the presumption that a lot of them are going to go into either academia or government. But this is a skill that you need to learn. So we're teaching them about podcasts, we're teaching them about doing media interviews and TV interviews and radio interviews and how to do advocacy. And so we had one thing talking about historically about the AIDS and how antiretroviral therapy was pushed by groups of activists. Next year, I really want to introduce what happened in Calgary with the reintroduction of fluoride, because I think that's a fascinating story about how you can actually move the needle on stuff. So this is the type of stuff that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to focus on one particular thing, which is storytelling in science communication, which is not something we think about a lot, and yet a lot of health journalists have realized that this is important. And there's obviously different type of journalists out there. There's daily journalists who are doing like the breaking news of the day, but a lot of the people doing long-form content have realized that storytelling is important. And when you start out, at least for me, I kind of bristled at this a little bit because I was trained on data, right? A single example doesn't mean anything. And I would always get a little bit frustrated with journalists when they were like, well, we need a face for the story. Like, you can't do a story about measles, you have to have a story of a baby with measles who's crying. And that bothers me, right? That bothers me deep in my soul. It's one of the many things that keeps me up at night. But I sort of have come to start understanding what they're talking about. Because if you don't have those visuals, if you don't appeal to the emotions of people, you aren't using all the tools at your disposal. And that is why the pseudoscience people often do so well. They appeal to emotion. And it's a tricky thing because you don't want to abandon all the stuff that makes us data-driven. And yet you have to realize that we have to change the way we approach things. And I'm always remembered by this classic line from The Guns of Navarone with Gregory Peck. For people who don't know the movie, it's a World War II movie. They're on an island, not an island in Greece, I can't remember which one. They have to destroy some guns that the Nazis have set up so that the American ships can pass by without getting shot at. And they're having this conversation about how are they going to fight. And Gregory Peck says, if we're going to win this war, we have to be every bit as nasty as the enemy. I just hope that we don't wake up one day and realize that we're even nastier. And I think that's how we have to start thinking about this, is that we have to restructure what we're doing without losing our souls in the progress. Little joke there for you guys. Anyway, so this is the class. I'm happy to talk about this more at the end. I'll try to finish early, even though I do have 130 slides, just so that we can talk about stuff. And of course, we have the panel at the end. And I'm really curious, again, how you guys would see something like this, which is a little bit off kilter to what a traditional critical thinking course would be about. But anyways, I'm here to talk to you about food myths. And the question is, why food myths? Like, why is that my thing? Well, here's the problem. If you were just a member of the general public, which of course we all are, you could be forgiven for thinking that this is how journalists make the headlines. They spin 3 wheels and you find out that coffee can cause depression in rats. And then the next day they spin the wheels again and it turns out that red wine can cause glaucoma in twins. All right? It's hilarious, but it's not completely unjustified because everything has been shown to both cause and prevent cancer, right? Everything, and I do mean everything, with the exception of bacon that we saw yesterday, right? But everything has been shown to both cause and prevent cancer. And it's not even subtle. If you read Time magazine, you will, on the same day, see them tweet that coffee is both a carcinogen and something that will help you live longer. You will find, if you read American newspapers, that fish oils are both protective and ineffective for treating heart disease. And on any day of the week, you will find out that you should be eating a low-fat, high-carb or a low-carb, high-fat diet based on whatever the headline of the day is. And you might say to yourself, okay, but Chris, what does this have to do with the crisis in public health that we are facing? And I'll tell you why. Because food myths are a gateway drug. And I firmly believe that. And now, okay, we can debate the science of gateway drugs. But the confusion allows people to say nonsense. It allows the health secretary of the United States to go on TV and eat burgers and French fries while talking about how he wants to make America healthy again. Like, that happened, right? And there's an absurdity to it. But if you have this constant flux, if you have this constant uncertainty, then nothing becomes sacred anymore, right? You can say anything because everything's up for grabs. And if you have a HHS secretary that's able to believe that fat is good for you and we should be putting beef tallow on anything because that's what real men eat. They eat meat and raw meat with the juice dripping down your chin, right? Once you are allowed to create that type of narrative, well, then you can create a narrative on anything, right? You can become famous and start saying ridiculous things about the COVID vaccine. And so it may seem bizarre to think that debunking food myths is a way to debunk COVID myths, but it makes sense to me. I'll find out if it makes sense to you in the question and answer period. But that's kind of how I'm approaching this, because when the public sees this, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you, well, guess nothing is true anymore, you're able to generate headlines like this. And pre-COVID, when John Ioannidis wrote this paper, I saw it, as I think a lot of people did, as a necessary wake-up call to improve the methodology of science. He was being very intelligently critical about science. But looking back on it now, and of course now I can see how he sort of like went off a cliff during COVID, I look at it now and I say to myself, was this actually as helpful as we thought it was? Because you started to get people talking about lies in medical statistics, right? There's the famous Mark Twain quote, there are lies, there are damn lies, and then there are statistics. And of course, you would hear stories about research fraud in medicine, which actually happens. And the rise of social media just allowed everybody to just start questioning everything, right? If the scientists are wrong, then maybe I'm right. And that's really hard for me because my life objective is to fact check the internet. And fact-checking the internet is actually really, really hard. The good news is I have a very, very good assistant that's helping me. And I don't mean Sophie. The assistant that's helping me is Toby. And Toby is a very, very good boy. And I mentioned Toby for a very important reason, and it's what I was talking about with Nat yesterday off mic, off camera. I say off camera just because that's like the world I live in when talking to media. But we were talking about posts and what's the thing. When I post photos about Toby, I get so much more engagement than anything else I do. Hundreds of people took the time to write in and wish Toby a happy birthday. And I don't mean they liked and they saw the post. They wrote messages, and sometimes very long messages. Congratulations, Toby, I hope you have a beautiful birthday. And like, really? But they do, and they love it. Now, to be fair, Toby is God's perfect angel, right? Clearly, he is a perfect creature of pure love. When he comes home, he is so happy to see me, he pees a little bit, which made me realize how much all of my friends are fakers. I mean, even my own wife doesn't do that. It's like, I was FaceTiming with him yesterday, and he was like, Daddy, when are you coming home? And I was like, soon, Toby, soon. And again, a few years ago, the idea of this, of like posting photos with your pets, it would have been like, that's silly. Why are we doing things that are so absurdly silly? But it kind of works. Because if you want to be out there, if you want to be on the national media debunking stuff and telling people like, no, don't listen to Aaron Rodgers. Football players don't know what they're talking about. They know how to play football. They don't know anything else. If you want to be out there, you have to engage with people. And people engage with stuff that we in academia would normally think it's silly. So I said to myself, okay, and the way I started thinking about a book, which is the book that I'm going to talk to you about. I was like, okay, I want to write a book about epidemiology to explain to people why we get stuff wrong. But I'm like, I can't say it's a book about epidemiology because no one's going to buy it. And I said, okay, but let me make it about food, because everybody cares about food, right? Everybody is interested in food. Everybody has heard food myths. I'm like, okay, let me make it about food myths. And so the first draft of the book, I wrote it out, and I was like, it's a very standard thing. The first chapter was about coffee, and I started talking about selection bias, and I was talking about the famous New England Journal paper with McMahon and all, and about pancreatic cancer and how it was selection bias and Bergson's bias, things that are very commonly known in the field of epidemiology that a lot of students would know. And I wrote it, for a lay audience, and I thought it'd be really interesting. And I sent it to the publisher, and they're like, yeah, it's kind of good, but can you just make it more interesting? Because there's a lot of books like this. And then I was like, okay, how do I do this? How do I do this? How do I do this? And I said, well, I'm kind of like Plato and Galileo. I'm at that level. Can I make it like a Socratic dialogue? Can I make the book like a conversation between two people? And we were bouncing ideas off with the publisher, and they were like, yeah, that's kind of interesting. Let's give it a shot. So I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. Plato, Galileo, me. Right, obviously. So I write the book in that way as a thing, and I sent it to a friend of mine. I go, what do you think? Do you think this would work? And she was like, so the conversation was between a doctor and a barista, and they were talking about coffee. And so I sent it to my friend of mine, and she was like, yeah, it's pretty good, but I kept expecting him to ask her out at the end. And the minute she said that, I was like, oh, this is a romantic comedy. So I wrote a book about epidemiology and food myths as a romantic comedy. So it really is a comedy. The character goes off, he does things, he meets people, there's a plot, there's a subplot, and it all ends up in the end. And the point of this, I'm not going to read you excerpts from the book, or I should have, but the point of this is that we can take the scientific teaching and roll it into a package that is more entertaining. And to some degree, I think we've already realized we started to do that because, like I said, everybody has a podcast. This one's mine. You started with my friend Jonathan there. You can make it fun. You can make it funny. Now, it doesn't have to be a book. It doesn't have to be a podcast. It can be a cartoon, right? XKCD is a great source of science cartoons. They're not just about health and misinformation, but some of them are really funny. And when you can make people laugh, the idea sticks, right? So we've tried to do the same. We did cartoons about, the difficulties of translating stuff into animal studies, and I think it's fine because the scientists are talking about, oh, BPA is toxic to rats, let's ban it from all products. And then the rats are talking to each other, and they're like, apparently the scientists are lactose intolerant, we should stop eating cheese, right? So there's difficulties about translating back and forth between animal and human studies, and I think that's funny, right? So we have to start doing things in different creative ways, and this is what the book was. And the book is essentially 9 different myths. There were supposed to be 10, but I got tired. So 9 different myths. Also, the publisher was like, your book is 300 pages long. It's time to start landing the plane. I'm like, okay. They're all about individual food myths. But there is a layer to all of this. And so the way I did it, and the reason why I'm talking to you about this in a science education conference, is that when you look back at the course and how it's sort of structured, I was able to use all of these things to give the students, when I talked about this, whether it's to the public or to students, you give them a framework. Every chapter, and if we take the first chapter as an example, and this is what I'm going to walk you through, you can use it as a case study to teach a point. So if you're going to talk about vitamin C in the common cold, which it does nothing, right? If any of you get sick, don't go out and take vitamin C. You're wasting your money. All these products, billion-dollar industry, does nothing. But let me tell you why. Because it is very easy to just say, no, it doesn't work. And to be fair, there are some people that like that. There are some people who are like, no, just tell me what I'm supposed to know. And you're like, fair enough. So, not everybody likes this format. The comments for the book have been generally positive, although some people are like, I didn't like the story. I didn't like the characters. I wish you had just cut it out and just told me the stuff straight. I'm like, okay, that's fair, right? Not everything is going to appeal to everybody. Some people wrote comments that were sort of unhelpful. Like some person said there was too much reading. And I was like, what did you think was it was a book. What did you think was going to happen? Anyways, it's not for everybody. But I think also if you're going to do it, you can have this story where the vitamin C chapter, which is the opening chapter, it's 2 people meet in an airport. Okay, so that's the beginning of the story. So you have a framework of a story, and then you can have jokes about airlines and waiting in line and how if you've ever flown commercial, it's like, a giant chaotic like mess, especially if you're flying economy. That really sort of lowers my faith in humanity every time I do it. But then you can debunk the food myth, which is about vitamin C and the common cold. But you can use that as a way to explain and teach people about subgroup analyses and p-hacking, which you can then use to apply to different other aspects of medicine and other issues that we have in the field of science. So from the scientific perspective, I could, if I was giving a lecture to students, just tell them, you want to debunk this, we'll go to the Cochrane Review, Vitamin C for Prevention of the Common Cold, and it basically says that it does nothing, right? If you read the highlighted portion, the failure of vitamin C supplementation to reduce the incidence of colds means that supplementation is not justified. Okay, it's pretty straightforward, right? And there were a few positive studies, but these were not replicated in the few trials that have been carried out. So it's an overall pretty clear message from the Cochrane group, vitamin C does not work. But there are some nuances in there. They say that there might be a benefit to brief periods of severe physical exercise, and the duration of severity of colds might be decreased. So if we're going to teach students how to analyze data and how to sift through this stuff, we have to explain to them what the problem with these particular claims are. And again, my bias is I look at everything from a very mathematical, methodological point of view, okay? And that's not going to be applicable to everyone. Right? And it's going to be different for undergraduate versus master's students. But again, for a master's public health students, I want them to be able to know when you get a report like this, how do you not tear it apart, but how do you go through it and understand the nuance and why sometimes things go wrong? So I start out, tackle the exceptions, okay. So you start out with the very, very basic stuff, depending on the level of the student you're dealing with. So the way I start off is, okay, correlation is not causation. That's an easy enough thing to prove, right? It's an easy enough thing to show students, and you can start with just ludicrous examples that make it very easy. So again, you go through XKCD, you can find examples to show people how these things go wrong, right? And so there are problems with using population density maps because they really just map to the overall population. So you use an external example just to make an extreme example to make it funny to students, right? And you can show them that just because two things are correlated does not mean that one causes the other. Same here. You can go on Reddit and find good pictures to illustrate the point. So once you get some good laughs and you get the audience warmed up, you take them a step further. You go to websites like tylervision.com, Spheres Correlations. I know a lot of people have used the slides before. And this is a very, very funny website. You can actually use his graphics. He said so. He's like, feel free to use them. He actually published a book, which is just a compendium of all of them. And what he's done is he's gotten all these government website data, and he's just analyzed them, right? He just goes through them and he finds correlations and he maps them out. And the ones that are funny, he posts on his website. So you can show the students how the average age of Miss America is correlated with the number of murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. You can show how US spending on science, space, and technology is correlated with the number of suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. And you can show that the number of people who drown by falling into a swimming pool directly correlates with the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. And I think this is an important thing because we teach students about the importance of not data dredging. And yet, what do we do in real life? We tell them, keep analyzing your data set until you find something. How many times, for those of you who supervise students or who have been a student, have you been told, oh, this didn't work, try this. Oh, this didn't work, try that. Oh, this didn't work, try this. And you're like, at a certain point, aren't we all p-hacking? We all kind of do it. And I think we have to sensitize them to how ludicrous that can become when we get it wrong. Because these are comedic examples designed to be funny and to get a laugh, but there are people out there, right? There was a time, not that long ago, when people hypothesized that polio was caused by ice cream. Not because of malice, not because of the current misinformation climate we find ourselves in, but because people looked at polio cases and ice cream sales and they're like, oh, these curves kind of overlap. And now, of course, now we know it's obviously not that. It's caused by a virus. The viruses would spread more in the summer. That's why, and ice cream sales would peak in the summer. So we know that now. But I think it then becomes important to show the students, no, this is the real world examples of how this stuff can make you go wrong, especially even in the field of public health, where intelligent people thought this. And at this point, they'll be like, yeah, okay, this is like polio. We're talking like in the 1950s. Like, no one believes this anymore. But when you go onto the dark corners of the internet, you're not going to find people trying to tie polio cases to ice cream sales. You're going to find people trying to tie polio cases to pesticide use, using the same basic idea, okay? And so that's the point. We can say correlation does not equal causation, and of course it doesn't. But you have to sort of bring them along the pathway to start with a funny example and make it increasingly more serious and increasingly more important. Because this is a thing that people will say. I had a friend, an acquaintance that I sort of knew from medical school, went off to BC, don't speak to her anymore obviously, but somebody had posted some variant of this. And I don't remember who it was, I don't remember if it was Mercola or somebody else. But this thing is like, you know, the countries that use a lot of pesticides have more polio. And she was like, oh, this is very interesting and worrisome. And I was like, what? And that's because we say these slogans, but we don't give people the methodological training to be able to unpack it when they come. Because this is what's being shared. And from a superficial perspective, you're like, oh, is that true? Because the numbers are true, I mean, presumably. I remember I looked at this a few years ago and it was basically true, but it's like, it's easy to see how you wouldn't know how to pick this apart when somebody showed it to you, especially if they showed it to you like on the spot and you're having like an internet debate or whatever, okay? So, correlation does not equal causation. The next step deeper into this spiral that I'm dragging everybody down into with me is to talk about why these things happen. Like, why do we see these associations? Well, they're fundamentally random. And that is a really hard thing for us to wrap our heads around because we do not understand randomness, right? Randomness happens to other people, not to us, right? It's other people who make mistakes. And so the way I teach this is to talk about the ISIS-2 trial. Just show of hands, are people familiar with the ISIS-2 trial? Jonathan is, because he's heard me give talks like this many times. And it sort of shocks me how much, because this is not that long ago. So, fun fact, prior to 1988, we did not give people aspirin if they were having a heart attack, right? Like, the use of aspirin to treat heart disease is a surprisingly recent scientific discovery, which is why I always say, if somebody offers you a trip in a time machine, don't take it. The past was horrible. If you had a heart attack in the 1970s, there was basically no medical treatment. You either got better or died. Like there was very little medical science was going to do for you. You just had nurses there to like help you get water if you couldn't reach it at the bedside table. It's really fascinating. Small aside, if you ever have to read a book, read a book called The Hurricane Years. It's not a great book, but I really liked it. It was about this guy who has a heart attack from stress, which is not really a thing. But he has a heart attack and he has to spend a week in bed and he reflects on his life. So it's this interesting character study and I kind of liked it. And I loved it because it shows you what cardiovascular care was like in the 1950s. And basically said you have to be on bed rest for 2 weeks. And it was like, oh wow, that was a wild time to get sick in a hospital. So I think that's funny. The reason I bring this up, ISIS-2, back when you could say the word ISIS without getting arrested. The ISIS-2 trial was the second study from this Italian research group, and it showed that aspirin was beneficial if you have a heart attack. And I bring it up because there was one subgroup of patients who did not benefit from taking aspirin. Is this ringing a bell for anybody? Who is the subgroup of patients who did not benefit from taking aspirin? I usually ask people to guess, and they say people on blood thinners, people with allergies. I'm like, no. The subgroup of people who did not benefit were Geminis and Libras. And this is not a joke. This is an actual scientific study. You can go to the Lancet. It is there. And the authors purposefully put this in because what happened was, the story is, they wrote the manuscript, they sent it in, the journal was like, put this subgroup in, put this subgroup in. And at one point they were like, okay, stop. We'll do it, but we want to include this subgroup as well because they wanted to make a point that all these subgroup analyses should be taken less as evidence about who benefits than as evidence that such analyses are potentially misleading. Because their data table, their data figure looked like this. And the one subgroup on astrological sign was that red arrow right there. So they did a lot of different subgroups on age, on diabetes, men versus women, people with prior cardiovascular disease. And not inappropriate, right? These are standard things that we do. But the problem is we don't always appreciate how random this stuff can be. And so when I'm trying to explain to students why this happened, I show them the experience of another group of students. there was a famous paper published in the BMJ during the Christmas issue, when they have the joke articles, but they're not really jokes, they're real studies. It was called Miracle Dice Therapy. And so this was Counsel and all in the British Medical Journal. And what Counsel did was, this was a neurology conference, so he went to the conference, he got the neurologist, said, we're going to do an exercise on statistics. And they were like, okay. So he gave them dice, and he said, you're going to roll dice, record the results, and we're going to analyze the data together. And what he said was, there's 3 different dice to represent 3 different therapies. So they're randomly rolled, and if you roll a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, there's no event. If you roll a 6, the patient died of the stroke, so the medication didn't work. And the students were told that some dice might be more effective, like they might be loaded dice, more likely to give you a 6. So the students were like, okay, so they rolled the dice, they generated the data, they thought, okay, standard statistical exercise. And they came back with the conclusion that the red dice were more loaded than the white and the green dice. It actually didn't meet statistical significance, but there was a bit of a spread between them. And they're like, okay, it's the red dice that are loaded. And then Counsel said to them, and he said, ha ha, ha ha, no, all the dice were identical. All the results that you saw were purely due to chance. And that was a very interesting thing to do, because it's one thing to be told that randomness happens. It's another thing to do it yourself. Because the students didn't believe him. They were like, no, but I rolled the dice. I saw the 6s. And my favorite quote of the article is like, student A says, some of the participants were convinced that their own dice were really loaded. One student said he rolled a 1 6 followed by another and a third. He said that his room felt eerily quiet as he rolled a 4th 6, because he had never rolled 4 6s in a row in his entire life. And of course, if you're there, you would feel the same. You'd be like, this is wild, 4 6s in a row. And yet, eventually, if you have enough people in a room rolling dice, eventually one of them is going to get 4 6s in a row. In the same way you put enough monkeys in front of enough typewriters, eventually you're going to get William Shakespeare, right? Eventually it will happen. But we have a hard time wrapping our heads around it. And that's why we fall victim to multiple hypothesis testing. Because when we set the type 1 error rate, for people who don't have the stats background, so the type 1 error rate is the probability that you will claim that there's a difference between 2 groups when none actually exists. By default in science, we set it at 5%, and that's kind of where the 95% confidence interval comes from, but not really. It's why we use a p-value of less than 0.05 as a cutoff. Very, very basic, actually a little bit more convoluted than that. But the problem with this is, you do 1 test, your chance of a false positive is 5%. But do 2 tests, your chance of a false positive is 9.75. You do 5 tests, it's up to 22%. You do 10 tests, it's up to 40%. It scales quickly. And we don't always fully appreciate how much this stuff is throwing us. And so once you explain this to students, and I wish I had the time in the course to have them do the dice thing themselves, actually, and I don't know, maybe I'm going to try to do it next year, because it would be so much fun to do it, because who plays with dice anymore, right? The era of Dungeons and Dragons are over. There's something great about doing stuff practically with your own hands, because it's like you have a really hard time believing it. But we do it over and over again. We fall for this mistake over and over again. Because, let's say, you were reporting on the National Toxicology Program's experiment about radiation in mice and rats from cell phones. If people remember the story from a few years back, the NTP did a study in male and female rats and mice, and what they found was a signal for positive cardiac schwannomas, which is a type of cancer in the nerve cells around the heart. But it was only for cardiac schwannomas, not for schwannomas overall. And they also saw a signal for malignant gliomas, but only for one type of cell phone signal, not the other. And they only saw it in male rats, not female rats and not male and female mice. And they examined, because they were basically doing autopsies on these rats, right? They sacrificed them. So they checked for every type of cancer in every body organ. So if you can imagine their data table, which looked something like this, they looked for liver cancer and pancreatic cancer and breast cancer, stomach cancer. Most of them were negative. They had a few positive signals. And yet the interpretation that came out, and that was reported in the media, was, oh, so cancer signal from cell phones. And my thing was like, no, this is random chance. But this is the National Toxicology Program. This is the US government. These are like big scientists. We don't think it can happen to us because we are really, really bad at picking up the fact that we might be p-hacking, right? And the best example of this is Brian Wansink. People know Brian Wansink? Yeah. I think a well-known example. For people who don't know, Brian Wansink was the director of the Cornell Food Lab. He was the guy who came up with the bottomless soup bowl, right? This was the experiment where If you're sitting there and eating soup, he had a secret pipe and he was piping more soup into the bowl. Once you say it out loud, you're like, wait a minute, how did the people not realize there was a pipe under the table? There's some doubt about whether the experiment actually happened when you look at the mechanics of what he was describing. But he was the one also, he looked at the joy of cooking. He said sample sizes have been increasing over every iteration, every publication issue of this cookbook. That's why we're having an obesity epidemic. He was the one who said if you put stickers on fruit, kids are more likely to eat it, which is why you were seeing stickers of Elmo on apples for a few years. Like, people remember that was happening for a while. He was a big name researcher. He was advising presidents. And a lot of what he published was actually not true. Not because of fraud, not because of malice. He would just tell people, and what exposed it was he wrote this blog post called The Student Who Never Said No. And he's like, I had this grad student, and she came to me and she said, I analyzed the data you gave me, I don't find anything. And I told her, you go back and you keep analyzing the data until you find something. And wouldn't you know it, she got 2 papers out of it. And then the comments people are like, Brian, you realize you just told her to do like p hacking. And he was like, what's that? And he genuinely didn't know. I mean, again, you don't want, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. It really does appear that he had no idea that this was problematic. His thing was like, no, you keep analyzing data until you find the truth, because I'm Indiana Jones, and I dig and I dig and I dig until I find the Temple of Doom. But it discredited 20 years of research, and a lot of the way we talk about food actually was driven by him, and it's not true. Like, I quoted him before, the idea that portion sizes are going up. I said that. I'm not actually sure it's true anymore. The idea of the bottomless soup bowl and why we should have smaller plates because our eyes are conditioned to eat what's in front of us. I don't actually think that's true anymore. I mean, it might be, but it might not. I don't know, right? And so when you're teaching and you're showing students these things, you can actually show them the dangers of publication bias and how it can cause a problem, because you can get anything published if you're willing to shred all the negative results that come with it. And these are not theoretical and just funny jokes. It happens because you can actually affect what data gets published. And Eric Turner, who I interviewed for an article once, very nice guy, and he was telling me he was working at the FDA, and he was like, how come all these negative SSRI studies are not getting published? And people were like, oh yeah, that's how it always is. The negative studies never get published. They just submit it to the FDA to fulfill regulatory requirements. And he was like, you should probably tell somebody about this. And that's where that paper came out of. And this is a very real problem, because if you're reviewing the evidence, which is what we all do when we're out there to debunk and talk to students, well, we can only review the evidence that's out there. And so publication bias is a big problem. And of course, the obvious solution is replication. I keep quoting John Ioannidis, and I kind of have to update those things, I guess, at some point. But the problem with replication is that you don't see it very much in science because it's hard, you know? There's a reason why magicians don't replicate their magic tricks. There's a reason why scientists don't replicate their studies. It may not work a second time. And we are conditioned to look for success, which is problematic, and we need to change. And so if you're doing this as a case example with regard to vitamins, now you have to sort of tie all this together, right? You've entertained your audience, you've entertained your students, you showed them all these crazy things. You go back to vitamin C and the common cold, and you're like, well, this is why vitamin C doesn't actually work, despite the fact that you have certain things in the Cochrane Review saying that it does, right? So let's tackle the exceptions now that you've learned all these statistical points. Because the overall review says this, these are the basic messages, these are the exceptions, like we talk about. If you actually read the paper and go through, and it's very hard to read a Cochrane Review because it's hundreds of pages long, it's very dense, there's a lot of appendices, you have to keep going back and forth because there's no hyperlinks in the papers, it's a bit of a pain. A lot of people will think that if you take vitamin C only when you start getting sick, it will do something, and it won't. It absolutely will not. The claim that vitamin C will reduce the duration of your cold is only in people who take vitamin C regularly. So you have to take vitamin C, and this is how the studies were done. You have to take vitamin C every day of your life, and then when you get sick, and you will still get sick the same number of times, but when you get sick, you will shorten the duration of your cold by about 8%. So if your cold lasts 3 days, you will shorten the duration of your cold by just under 6 hours. Okay? That's what the data shows. So now you have to make a decision. Is this cost effective or not? Now, I would argue no, because it's such a trivial benefit and it's based on a small number of studies, and I don't actually think it's true, okay? But more relevant and more funny is, I think, this one, which is, oh, but vitamin C does work in periods of short, intense exercise, especially exercise in cold weather. And where does that come from? So this is the graphic from the Cochrane Review. And what they're basically saying, overall, there's no benefit, right? These are all the studies. But there is a benefit in these studies, in this subgroup, which is periods of short, intense physical stress and cold weather. And they're like, okay, I guess I can kind of biologically believe that's true. You're stressed, it's cold, you're more likely to get sick, even though I kind of know that getting a cold doesn't mean that happens because you are cold, but that's linked in my brain. I can't disassociate myself from it. All right, maybe there's something there. It's theoretically plausible. But now you're like, oh, but I've seen so many examples where subgroup analyses are problematic and where this could all just be due to random chance, given it's just a small number of studies relative to the overall whole. And you're like, now I've introduced some doubt in the students. I'm like, well, let's actually look at these studies, okay? It's basically based on these 5 studies. Now, 3 of them, which were all done by the same research group, were done in people running an ultra marathon in South Africa. And it was 3 studies that comprised just over 100 people, okay? And you're like, all right, it's the same group finding the same result over and over again in the same basic experiment. You kind of wonder, why was that 3 different studies and not just one overall study over there? I'm like, all right, I'm not so sure about that. There's another study that was done in Canadian soldiers, yay Canada. And these were soldiers who were on subarctic military maneuvers who were getting vitamin C supplements, and they showed less incidence of colds. And of course, when you say this to a general population, they're like, okay, that makes sense because Canada is a frozen wasteland, and it's always cold there, right? So they're like, all right, that makes sense, except that it's actually unclear from the data when the study took place, whether it was summer or winter and what the meteorological conditions were. It actually doesn't even say because it's such an old study. But it represents such a small section. It was only about 50 people. And you're like, oh, that's a fairly small sample. I could easily see how by random chance you would see a small signal doesn't mean anything. But the bulk of the data is from this study, which was done in skiers. And you're like, okay, that makes sense. They're skiers, they're in the cold, they're like competing. It's not. And then you read the study and you're like, oh, it wasn't like Olympic skiers doing training. It was kids attending a ski school in the Swiss Alps. And you're like, well, okay. I mean, that sounds like a pretty good vacation, obviously. I mean, one assumes that there was, a lot of, one assumes there was a lot of cocoa involved in the process. And you're like, I don't know that what the study actually represents is what people actually understand. And so when you start breaking this stuff down and showing it to students, like, oh, okay, you're giving them a framework for how they can debunk. Now, I realize that what we're doing is debunking actual published research, right? This is not about, RFK Jr. going crazy and saying that aluminum, causes autism and like the really outlandish stuff. But I think it's important, especially when we're teaching students who are going to have roles in academia, to teach them how to be a little bit better about methodology, because they have to understand how to pick this stuff apart. Because the easy stuff is easy. The hard stuff is harder to do, and it takes a lot more patience and a lot more work. So anyways, if you're interested in the vitamin C stuff, I've started doing some work for Medscape. I don't know if people know what Medscape is. It's a website that's for healthcare professionals, but I've been starting to post some videos on there about this sort of stuff. And you can use the same basic example for all kinds of food. The other chapter in the book is about chocolate and cognitive health. And I try to tell people chocolate isn't health food, right? Even though there's a strong push by the chocolate industry to make it happen. And you use it again, the same type of thing. The basic food myth is chocolate isn't health food. The epidemiological concept is the ecological bias. And you can use an example from a popular study where it claimed that chocolate would increase your risk of winning a Nobel Prize. And this is a real study published in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is the data that they showed. And they were like, countries that eat more chocolate tend to win more Nobel Prizes. And when I ask people, like, okay, well, why do you think this is? And they're like, oh, it's because of funding and this. And yeah, there's a lot of potential explanations. But the bigger problem and the bigger concept here that people need to become sensitized to is that the problem with the analysis is that countries don't win Nobel Prizes and countries don't eat chocolate. People win Nobel Prizes and people eat chocolate. And you can't establish that the people who ate the chocolate are the people who won the Nobel Prizes. And this has a name. It's called the ecological fallacy. And it's that country-level exposures do not apply to individuals. And of course, it's something that we do all the time. If you're a researcher, especially if you're a health researcher, what do? You have access to large data sets, and you're just analyzing it. And you're like, well, do you actually have individual-level exposure? Or do you just have state or county-level exposure? It's not quite the same thing. And where do we see this? We see this with pesticides, right? We see this with a very famous example where, this is a bit dated, but does anybody remember when they were saying that saturated fat caused breast cancer? And it's because you look at the different countries and you're like, oh, the Western countries eat more saturated fat. And I go, no, it's because of, it's the ecological fallacy, right? The reason to teach these concepts is because they keep happening over and over and over again. And once you learn the vocabulary, you can become a much better debunker. And you know, of course, chocolate doesn't make you sick. And what I love about chocolate is that we've actually done a randomized controlled trial about chocolate with no benefit. And it was funded by Mars. It was a randomized controlled trial funded by the chocolate company, and they didn't even use chocolate. They used the cocoa bean extract, which worked in their favor, right? Because you're eliminating all the fat and the sugar that goes into chocolate. They do it, it comes out negative, nobody mentions it. We're still talking about chocolate as health food, even though this was the study that was supposed to debunk, it was supposed to end the discussion, and it happened, and we just kind of like, Whereas if it had been positive, you would have, for sure, Mars would have been like talking about it everywhere. Anyways, fun fact, I don't have the picture in this presentation. It's in a different one. But they are, we talk about big pharma, right, as being problem. Big chocolate is a problem. Like I'm not joking, Mars is funding university research departments to the point where they have a ribbon cutting ceremony and all the administrators are there with hard hats that look like M&Ms. And I'm like, I get they're not the pharmaceutical company, but still. And I realize we all need money because we're all desperate and poor. But it's like, it's a problem. It is a problem. Anyways, chocolate is not health food. Please don't give it to dogs. It's toxic to dogs. I'll go over very, very quickly about red wine, which is another one. Again, I use it to explain the problems with U-shaped associations. And because you see this a lot with the obesity paradox. Oh, maybe being a little bit overweight is good for you. No, it's not. So you explain the mathematical concept in it, and I go into the French paradox. Okay. So, by the way, does anybody, I sort of, whoops, backwards, no. Boop, 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 boop. Yeah, I don't think most people know this. Like the reason why the French paradox is so common, at least in North America, is because of Morley Safer. Prior to 1991 and Morley Safer's report, like people didn't really talk about the French paradox. It was published in the literature, but it wasn't part of the public discussion. And it's really because of 60 Minutes that it happened. And because of that, I still have patients that come into me, you know, doctor, it's really hard for me to, you know, I take all my medication, I try to exercise regularly, but it's really hard for me to drink 2 glasses of red wine a day because I really don't like red wine. And I have to explain to them, like, please stop drinking alcohol. It's not necessary. But it's because you see this U-shaped association where a little bit of alcohol seems to be good for you, but there's a mathematical reason for it, and it's called the sick quitter effect. And I'll just go over this very quickly because I want to finish on time. And it's that there's a difference between former drinkers and never drinkers. Because when you actually break it down in this way, what you see is it's the former drinkers that are driving the increased risk of the zero drinking group. And it's because people who used to drink alcohol and then quit probably quit for a specific reason, because they developed heart disease or cancer or some other medical problem. So it's not that abstaining from alcohol makes you sick. It's that people who get sick end up abstaining from alcohol. It's called reverse causation. And the same thing that you see with alcohol with the U-shaped association, you see with the obesity paradox, you see with something else called the smoking paradox, where smokers, pregnant women who give birth to premature babies seem to have, the babies have better outcomes if the mothers are smokers. That's actually a thing. It's called the smoking paradox, and it's a well-known case example in epidemiology. I mean, debunked now, but it's the same sort of thing. Reverse causation is a real problem. And so we know all of this, and of course, the French paradox is explainable by a number of different things, differences in medical coding between France and the US. There's something called a time lag hypothesis, where a lot of the changes that happened in Europe after World War II only became manifested later, whereas North America was largely spared of these things. So there's things that explain the French paradox. It's really not much of a mystery, even though I had a video go live today about this, and people are like, but no, like it's the same stuff. Like we're saying the same things over and over again. And people are not aware of this stuff, even though it's been fairly well established. And of course, when people have done Mendelian randomization studies, and if you don't know what Mendelian randomization studies are, I don't have the time to get into it, but it's a genetic type analysis, very interesting methodologically. You can actually get rid of a lot of these confounding variables by looking at genetics. And when you do genetically, people who drink a lot versus very little alcohol, the U-shaped associations that you would normally see go away. So the blue are the genetic ones, the red ones are the standard epidemiological analyses. I'll go over the rest to say, like, you know, the antioxidants in red wine don't really do anything. I like showing this picture because it's fun. You actually have to drink a lot of red wine to get enough resveratrol for it to make a difference. Basically, you have to drink hundreds of liters of red wine per day, and it would probably kill you. And of course, when we talk about a standard drink, most people don't know what a standard drink is. We're actually very, very bad at it. So the problem with nutritional epidemiology overall is that we have a real problem with data capture. It's very hard to measure what people eat. And it's very hard to measure what people eat because it's very hard to know. And we can say this as formally as we want, but until you show it to people, they're not really gonna get it, because this is what the Harvard Food Questionnaire looks like. It's basically like taking an exam in university. You have to go through pages and pages and fill out the little bubbles. And what they basically ask you is, please try to average your seasonal use of foods over the entire year. For example, if a food such as cantaloupe is eaten 4 times a week during the approximate 3 months that it is in season, then the average use would be once per week. I guarantee you people are not using calculators to fill out these questionnaires. Like, this is too convoluted. Everything we get is fundamentally a guess. But you have to show this to the students, because if they don't work with food epidemiology questionnaires, they're not going to realize the problems with it. And I was talking to a colleague of mine at McGill, and she was like, yeah, I don't use them anymore. I realized they're just like meaningless. It was a waste of money. But it's going to take time for these things to become common, understood knowledge. So, you know, I'm not sure that we're getting any information beyond simple guessing. So the point is, there's a lot of confusion out there. And I think it's interesting to start with food myths as a way of debunking this stuff, because the skills and the mathematical concepts are transferable, and it's a non-controversial way to teach people about stuff. So in the same way that when you're debunking the paranormal stuff, you start with the easy things and sort of build up to the more controversial stuff, my rationale, rightly or wrongly, I hope it's right, otherwise I've wasted my life and nothing I've done matters, you start with the stuff that's easy. Because when you're talking to people about eggs, they have no real emotional attachment to eggs, although now with the current climate in the US, maybe that's not true anymore, where people are like violent about, no, meat is good. And you're like, okay, Gomer. You know, and you know, it's easy to get depressed and you know, downbeaten by the current state of science and science communication and all that. But I think the point is this. People remember stories. I hope that if I had come out and given you like a more formal academic lecture about these statistical concepts, yeah, you might have liked it and you might have, but it maybe wouldn't have stuck to you. But I hope the stories are going to stick with you now, and I think that's the point. The point I'm trying to make is that we have to start telling stories. And we have to remember that our students, even if they are public health students that know the math, they are still members of the general public. A colleague of mine who just got hired at McGill, who wants to do more like, you know, science communication and debunking health myths, and we're going to talk about doing some grants together and all that kind of stuff. She wears an Oura ring. You know, that like wearable technology that tracks your sleep. It's nothing. It's garbage. Don't buy one. It's a waste of your money. But she wears one. And I was like, why? She was like, well, I don't know. I have money. It's selling it. Looks nice. I bought an Oura ring. It syncs to my phone. It tells me stuff. I'm like, okay. We are all members of the general public. We are all susceptible to this stuff. And so we sometimes think is that we don't need to go through the basics, but we do. And we have to start speaking to each other and to our students as if they are people. And the reality is people respond to stories. And that's why I basically wrote a story. So when you have the main characters talking about meat and whether it's good or bad for you or not, you can have the character of Jim saying, anyway, so one of the subplots was a romantic subplot between Jim and Katie's a vegetarian, Jim isn't, and he kind of likes her, but doesn't know how to ask her out, and he's like, maybe I could learn to like, and so the main character says to Jim, like, you know, Jim, you could probably learn to like salad. He's like, you know, I do like Cobb salad. I'm like, no, Jim, that has bacon in it. That's not the point, right? So you can have these sort of like funny lines where it's like, oh, I can have Cobb salad. You know, and Jim was one of my favorite characters to write. But, you know, and then you can have like when you're talking about selection bias and the difficulty of having recruiting patients from hospital databases because they're different than the general population, you can have Casey interject some levity into the discussion and be like, oh yeah, you know, I don't really like hospitals. The only part of hospitals I like is, you know, when you go to the neonatology ward and they let you look at the babies. They don't let me do that anymore. They said if I kept coming back, they would call the police. You know, you can have these types of moments of levity that break up the science, that make it more digestible for people. And so this is the type of stuff that we do. I'm telling people stories, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't. Maybe it's your cup of tea, maybe it's not, and it's fine, right? You don't have to like it. Like I said, some people are like, too much reading. Like, okay. But the point is, we need a diversity of voices to try different things, but we can't just do the same stuff over and over again. We need podcasts, we need videos, we need stories, we need cartoons, we need all of that. And so that, at 12 o'clock exactly, is where I will take your questions.
Questions?
Yeah.
If nobody's too hungry just yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned near the end that the rings that track
Yeah.
your sleep are garbage.
Yeah.
What do you feel about the smartwatches on tracking sleep? Same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, if you put it on your teddy bear, you would get almost the same data.
Okay.
Because what they're measuring is, because we have to understand what these things are doing. They're measuring movement, right? So the assumption is that if you're lying completely still, you're sleeping. But they don't actually know if you're sleeping. Yeah, they're tracking your heart rate. But I will tell you, as a cardiologist, when people come to me with their watch and like, oh, look at my heart rate, it's not useful to me. What I need is an actual tracing. Now, if you had an Apple Watch where you could put your finger on it and get the actual electrical tracing, that is useful. And that's why Apple has actually gotten that tested as a medical device. But you can only use it when you're conscious because you have to have your finger on it, right? Because just your heart rate in and of itself doesn't give me the information that I need as a clinician to treat you. Because it's okay for your heart rate to go low when you're asleep. It's supposed to do that. What you don't want is you don't want a heart block. And I don't know if you're having a heart block just based on the heart rate monitor. So the heart rate monitors are useful if you're like training because you want to get your heart rate up to a peak level, which is also like not really part of the conversation anymore. Like the idea of exercising into certain heart rate ranges has kind of fallen out of favor because it's not really useful, and it's a lot of extra effort for athletes for no real benefits. People just go exercise now, it doesn't matter. So they're not really that useful because they're not giving you actionable information. They're giving you a lot of data, but you can't use it clinically. And I guess that's, again, my bias, because you're like, well, no, engage me on this discussion about this. I'm like, I don't care, it's not useful. You can't bring it to your doctor and get treatment. At the end of the day, that has to be the final step of usefulness. Otherwise, what are you doing? Now, again, if you like it because it's a nice piece of jewelry, then okay. And people are like, oh, it's entertainment. I'm like, all right, I can think of better entertainment. But that's what people do. Like, people like interacting with the data. It gives them something to do. It's basically a fidget spinner with numbers. But none of us are immune to it. Why? Because as much as we think that we're scientists and we know better, we consume media like everybody else. And if you see all these celebrities with Oura rings, you're like, oh, I want to get one too. I have the disposable income, why not? It's not that much money. But yeah, a lot of these sleep trackers are not useful. If you need to actually do a sleep study, do an actual sleep study. And fun fact, you no longer really have to go to a sleep lab to do it. A lot of the machines have gotten smaller that you can do it at home, but you still need to have a validated medical machine that's actually going to measure your oxygen saturation to see if that's dropping, because that's when you know that you need a CPAP machine. Yeah.
What kind of feedback do you get from the students in the public health department about this line of classes that you need? Because you're using a lot of debugging in class that maybe they are not used to. They are probably much more used to like regular methodology classes.
Yeah.
So what kind of feedback do you get from students? Do they feel like they are more prepared to go into I don't know, into medical clinics or working through the data?
Yeah, I think it's mixed. So the feedback is mixed, generally positive. I had one student say, I love this class, it was the only class I was showing up to. Because you also have to understand how university students now, everything's online. Like, a lot of them just don't show up to classes anymore. That's just the reality we live in. They watch the stuff online. She's like, no, I actually showed up to class because we were doing a lot of hands-on practical stuff. But I do want to start putting in more. I really like your game, the game show thing. I really want to do that sort of thing because I want them to show up to class. So you have a lot of them that are interested. A lot of them are like, they are highly motivated. The ones who took the class were highly motivated because, again, it's the, Trump had just come to power, RFK Jr. A lot of them had the enthusiasm that you can only see in 20-year-olds, right? They were like, how do I change the world? And I'm like, you can't. Ha ha. And so breaking down their illusions was hard. And I don't know if, I think a lot of them were like, oh, how do I do it? And a lot of them were like, how do I do it? There is no answer. There is no, it's like the line from Kung Fu Panda. Like, there is no secret sauce. There is no secret ingredient. We just have to do it, right? I know, people seen the movie Kung Fu Panda? Yeah. It's like, you know, the panda main character, the Jack Black character, is like his father had this like secret ingredient. He says, no, there is no secret ingredient. You just do it. And I think that's the point. It's like, we just have to do this stuff. Like, you know, and it's not about winning or losing. I think a lot of times we get into this very like militaristic things, like we have to fight the opposition. Like, no, we just have to be out there. Misinformation has always existed, it always will exist. We just have to be there for the movable middle, which is frankly the vast majority of the population. Like, we know all these people. Most people are not even, like, the people we talk about, the issues we talk about, the general population often doesn't know what we're talking about. They're like, what? No, I never heard of this. What are you talking about? So you're just there to sort of like, I just did a thing for the radio now about like mineral and chemical sunscreens, right? The difference between the two, which is a big thing. And if you're on Instagram, oh my God, these influencers and these studies, and they're dangerous. Most people have no idea what we're talking about. They just want the surface level explanation, and we just have to be there to give it to them. And I think that's the message I try to convey to the students. Like, it's not about, because a lot of them really, I mean, not to go too far off topic, a lot of them really want to start marching in the streets. Like, and we had one person who was talking about advocacy, and they were talking about, you know, the AIDS campaign of the 80s and 90s and how they went and got themselves arrested to make a point. And I was like, guys, don't get arrested in the US right now. Don't. Like, and I go, listen, very practically, if you get arrested, you can no longer travel across international borders. You do not want a criminal record. Like, I understand so again, a lot of it is I kind of have to like temper the enthusiasm of youth a little bit because we don't live in the same world anymore. And the woman who was there, she was like, yeah, it was, you know, we went and we understood, like, it was fun, and I wouldn't get arrested in the US. I wouldn't get arrested anywhere right now, but I definitely wouldn't get arrested in the US. So it's like, a lot of the stuff that they coming with, like this very sort of like let's go and change, I don't want to break them of that, but I couldn't have to meet them, like there are better ways to do it, and that's why I want to talk about the Calgary fluoride example, which was basically, for people who don't know, because it's Edmonton, but Calgary reinstituted fluoride after having scrapped it for 10 years, and it was because a small group of researchers and their group really kept pushing the city hall to have a plebiscite on the issue, and they organized it, and they organized politically to have a referendum on it, and the referendum won. But that's how you get change. You sort of like get political change that way. It has to be a lot more subtle and a lot more specific than just going onto the street, because it's not the 1980s anymore, right? The stuff that worked for the AIDS epidemic, I don't think would work today, quite frankly. I think it would be too controversial. Then,
Great talk. Thanks for so many things that it's got me thinking. There's two things that you showed. One, I mean, you showed Eric Turner's paper, one of my favorite papers out there, to really start this discussion about how we can improve things in science. But one I'm a little less a fan of is Ioannidis' paper because there's so many assumptions and the way it's being used currently in the U.S. White House and other things. But I think when I track back a lot of the rumors that we track around health concerns, a lot of times they land or they start at university press offices.
yeah.
They'll take a paper
Yeah.
and then they amplify it in ways that didn't even need an influencer that has no
Yeah.
MD degree, PhD degree. It didn't need any of the dynamics that we study in our lab. It just started, and the mistake was at the university press office. So
Yeah.
what I'm wondering is, does your university press office, because of your expertise, your position, your interest in the space, have they ever reached out to you about, hey, before I send this out on this nutritional or cardiology paper, do they ever do that? Do they ever reach out to you? And I'm saying that mostly as a way of maybe thinking of a solution. Because I feel like university press offices are culprits in a lot of this.
Yeah, they are. It's a real problem. And you look at the press release and you're like, that's not what the paper said. You know, they will interview you just to farm a quote to put it in there. And I think that's one of the reasons why I have the students actually write a press release. Like, so you like here's the paper, write the press release. You got to get the newspaper's attention, but you also can't oversell it. Like, you can't write clickbait. And that's hard for them to do, and so forcing them to understand how you thread that needle is a problem. What I've told the university, because I do know these people, actually it's funny, like the guy who came to teach a class, very spontaneously ended up being friends with my new wife's cousin, and so we met at our birthday party, and I was like, Jason, what are you doing here? And I've given them lectures and stuff. What I think the solution is for the press office to run the press release by the primary researchers before they ship it out. And a lot of places won't. A lot of places won't because that's their policy. And that's an easy thing to fix because it's an easy policy to fix. Have the researchers vet it. And they think they do it at McGill mostly, unless they're like in a rush. But that is a real problem, and you're right. And the solution is very simple. It's like have the researchers not write the press release, because not everybody's a good writer, but at least look at it first and be like, well, that's not actually accurate. And so, let them make the sauce, but you make sure that you've cooked the noodles properly before it goes in there.
Well, that was a great cap to this morning session. Thanks so much, Chris. And as we go to lunch, let's maybe do a scavenger hunt, Rod, for how many food myths can you find during lunch?
That's good.
Okay, thank you.